big conversation here tonight at the 9 p.m. Urban Debate. Viewers, you may have heard that our GDP contracted 23.9% during April to June. For the first quarter, our GDP contracted 23.9%. Essentially, in a way, we are saying that our country's output was wiped out. A quarter of it was wiped out in just 3 months. Now, obviously, there are no prizes for guessing that a large part of this is because of the lockdown. In April, we were in a complete shutdown mode. The activity began to start again very slowly in the month of May, and some more unlocking happened in the month of June, which is why you're seeing this kind of an impact. But if you ask experts and noted reputed economists, they are sounding off warning bells. They are saying it's not just those 3 months when we were in a lockdown, and it may not just be 23.9%. A lot of data comes later on. A lot of analysis and data collection and calculation happens slowly. And so this number may actually be even worse. Now, what does it mean when somebody says the country's growth is minus 24%? Essentially, we are saying that we are not growing anymore. We are actually contracting. Our country's total gross domestic product, our output, has actually shrunk. What does this mean for you and me? Well, simply put, it means tough times. It means job losses. Job losses that have already happened to the tune of crores. It means businesses shutting down. It means businesses who have taken loans but are not making any money will have bad loans. It means tougher times for banks to deal with those bad loans. If you and I don't have a job, if you and I don't get a salary appraisal, if you and I actually get a salary cut, we will spend less. So it means we will start dipping into our savings. We will start cutting back on our expenditure. If you and I don't spend money, businesses don't make any money. And hence this cycle will continue and the situation becomes tough. I have experts tonight to help us understand exactly this. Without getting into the complicated economic details and what is really thrown around everywhere, let's talk about what does this mean for you and me? How do I survive this year? Since the time our country started calculating the GDP in the early 90s, we've never seen such a situation where the economy has contracted. We've mostly only seen a boom. So it's very difficult to imagine what life could be when the country's economy is shrinking. Now, I also want to tell you, it's not just for those 3 months. Take a look at what the big agencies are estimating for this entire year. GDP set to contract 10.5% for this year, says Fitch Ratings. India Ratings says GDP set to contract 11.8% for this year. Goldman Sachs is the latest one that has come out today and said, and they have a higher one. They say the GDP will contract 14.8% for this entire year. GDP, viewers, is an indicator of a country's economic performance. It includes the final value of the goods and services that we produce in 1 year, the gross domestic product. And of course, we measure it quarterly, and then over a year, we see how the growth is. Now, going into the lockdown, the situation wasn't that great either. We were already in a massive slowdown that's just been made worse. Let's try and decode this. Say good evening to the panelists who are joining us right now. Dr. Ajay Dua, a former Commerce Secretary, with me this evening. Professor Ramakumar, economist at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. Mr. R. Gopal, and former Secretary with the Department of Economic Affairs with me. And Mr. Sugata Ghosh, Associate Editor with the Economic Times, also with us. And Madan Sabnavis, Chief Economist at Care Ratings, with us this evening. Mr. Sabnavis, good evening to you. Let's begin with you. if you can help add to what I have just said in terms of what does it mean for a common man? How does my life change? What should I be bracing myself for this year?
Actually, in short, one can say uncertainty. Because the way things have turned out, I think we had the lockdown, and subsequently we have seen, as you've already mentioned, that we have been affected on account of salary cuts, loss of jobs, which really means that the consumption is going to come down. And the so-called festival season, which is coming just around the corner from the months of October onwards, may not really be a very cheerful season for us. And uncertainty is something which I think is the clue out here, because even in case I do have income, I'm not quite sure what's going to happen in future. I'm not quite sure if the economy is going to continue to move around, if enterprise will flourish, will there be more periodic lockdowns, and if the supply chains get affected. So I think that is something which is really getting affected, which has a backward linkage even in terms of investment taking place in the economy and overall growth. So I think the numbers which you spoke about of what different agencies have, we ourselves at CARE had a number of 6.5%, which is waiting for a few more data points before we revise it further downwards. And our sense is maybe another 1.5 to 2% further down, it could go more in the region of around 8%. But it's going to be a very hard times because of this uncertainty. I think we won't be able to take any consumption decisions, which is going to affect business. So therefore, they will not be able to invest unless they see demand coming through. And I think what we were all expecting is for the government to come up with some kind of a stimulus in terms of tax cuts or any additional expenditure, which it looks like is very unlikely because the government has been focusing more on the credit side, more in terms of supply responses rather than things on demand. So I think with 6 months still to go, 7 months to go in this particular year, we don't really see anything major, any major changes. But I think a lot of FMCG companies, for example, are hoping that the third quarter will be buoyant, especially from the rural economy. But I think we should be a bit guarded on that because we cannot expect the rural economy to drive the entire economy because 14% of GDP comes from agriculture, around half of that comes from your crops. So that can definitely not be driving the economy. So I think all of us will be very much guarded in terms of our economic responses in these uncertain times.
Yes, in fact, even on the rural economy front that you mentioned, the expectation that many have is because of a good, agricultural season, a good crop, and thereby, people having more money in the rural areas. But there are many who are also questioning how much of it has actually translated into good amount of income for the farmers and others who live in rural areas. And this, so we don't know how much that is going to help us yet. We can hope it does help to a certain extent. But if I just come back to the bare basics, once again, Mr. Ramakumar, bare basics. For a common man, will I have a job? Will I have a salary cut? Will I be able to pay my loan? If I don't pay my loan, what happens? Will my bank actually have a problem if the loan that they have given turns bad? Will they struggle? Will the businesses around me start shutting down? These are the tangible things that we see and how it affects us. Will the prices go up for food and other materials? Will I be able to, pay for my child's education this year? Those are the questions. Now, when somebody tells me, the country will see GDP contract by 15% or 10% this year. What does that mean? What should I brace myself for?
Tanvi, thank you. Let me begin by saying that the minus 23% growth rate for Q1 that has been put out officially now is actually quite affirmative of much of what myself and some of my colleagues have been doing for some time. My colleague Tejal Kanitkar and I, using an input-output analysis, have argued in a paper which is going to come out this week that the annual growth rate of 2021 is likely to be somewhere between minus 15 and minus 20%. That's going to be our estimate. All the other estimates that have been made earlier, if you may know, if you remember, were close to 10 to 15% on the minus side for Q1, but actual Q1 minus was 23. And that's close to some of our input-output results that we have put out. So I do think that the overall growth rate for 2021 will be closer to somewhere between minus 15 and minus 20%. And that's far worse than what many people have actually been arguing out. Many of the things that you put out there as the possible consequences are indeed possible. But what makes things worse is the following. One is this is not a slowdown which is proximate to what people call as the act of God. That's not the case. In fact, from around 2011-12 itself, Indian economy has in one way or the other been in a kind of a crisis or a slowdown. The investment rate has fallen from 2011-12. Savings rate has fallen from 2012. Exports to GDP ratio has fallen from 2011 and 12. The bank credit growth rate has fallen from 2011-12. Unemployment rate rose between 2011 and 17. Rural poverty levels rose for the first time after the 1970s between 2011 and 2017-18. Demonetization exacerbated the crisis in 2016 November. GST reform added to the whole problem. Thus, by 2020 March, when the lockdown began, Indian economy was in a highly vulnerable position compared to many other countries. This is the first point that I wanted to make. The second point that I want to make is that the pandemic and the lockdown, which was informed by a poor strategy, may I say, wreaked havoc in the economy after March. That's what is now in front of us as a minus 23.6% growth rate for Q1. Q2 and Q3 are also likely to be negative according to our calculations. Q4 may be a bit positive, but overall 2021 will be around minus 15 to minus 20%. There's going to be a huge rise in unemployment. There's already a fall in salaried employment. Sometimes we think that it is only a fall in casual labor employment, but salaried employment has also fallen. The burden of unemployment has been higher on scheduled caste and scheduled tribe groups compared to the general category of people. So there's going to be a lot of disproportionate impacts that are going to result on social groups, on religions, on rural and urban separately, and so on. So it's going to be a really bad time. By the time moratoriums are lifted in banks, you're going to see a sharp uptick in the default rates in banks, which will lead to a separate kind of crisis, and recapitalization will have to be thought about at a later stage by the government. But the real problem that I see at this point of time is that we have a government which is sitting absolutely silent, as if nothing is happening to the economy. And if it is an act of God, COVID is an act of God, God himself will probably take care of the revival as well. That's the most unfortunate circumstance in front of us. The government should, in my view, come out with an economic package, particularly after the new CSO results have come out with an economic package of at least 10% of the GDP, of which at least half of it is direct spending of the government, financed either by borrowing or through monetization of the deficit. It is urgent, it is important, it is imperative that the government comes out with a package of that sort. Otherwise, disaster is what awaits us in the later part of 2021.
Yes, absolutely. So let me ask this question to Dr. Ajay Dua. Dr. Ajay Dua, do you also believe that the government needs to move fast and move quickly? Has their response so far been appropriate to the gravity of the situation? I mean, we didn't need the numbers to actually tell us that the situation was so bad, but now that it's officially here, that it's 24% contraction, should we be looking and a little bit more worried?
Tanvi, first, thank you very much for having me on the show. I think the government's response in Q1 was majorly, let me put it this way, addressed to first saving lives. So it was for most of the provisions of the government, call it stimulus or the government succor, went to how to kind of, instead of preventing livelihoods, it was to prevent lives. And I don't think anyone can find fault with it when a pandemic of this dimension took place. Government had to worry that there is enough being provided for healthcare, enough food being provided, and those kind of things. Now that we know that the first quarter was probably the worst in the world in India, despite the incidence of pandemic during the first quarter not being as significant as we saw in many countries of Europe as well as the United States. So I'm not going into the question of whether the strict lockdown, etc., did added to the fall in the GDP. But the question is, now that we know we've not done well at all in the first quarter, what can we do in the second quarter? Second quarter, no doubt, has just got 4 to 3.5 weeks or 3 weeks left. But going forward, I think government needs to now shed its inhibition and not merely talk of a 20 trillion package, which largely consisted of bank loans, guarantees, and much less. People have estimated it to be only about, instead of 20 trillion rupees, that it was only 3 to 4 trillion, which was directly went into the economy for revival of the economy. But as was pointed out a little while ago by Mr. Sabnawis, most of it went for the supply side, which was how to keep the banks afloat, how to keep the production going. Whereas what was largely ignored was how to keep the demand going. Because we are finding that though, Tanvi, you would recall last week when the Reserve Bank governor released the report he talked about building up private consumption is the key to economic revival. And I can't agree more with that statement, because what you need is not the government consumption by itself, but building up the consumption in the economy means getting more demand to come, and more demand means more jobs being created, labor-intensive activities, more of, lucky for us, that food grain production is at an all-time peak virtually. And the procurement of the rabi crop has been very good. Okay. Going forward, we think it will be the same thing with Kharif. But what we need now is let the government not worry too much about its fiscal deficit. The rating agencies are not going to be downgrading it if it is targeted and it yields results in the right direction, that it gets the economy going. I think the rating agencies will be happy that the government, by upfront expenditure, be it in investment or by government, but in labor-intensive activities like house construction, green infrastructure, or I would even say some amount of healthcare for the long term, that also could be done. But if the government doesn't do that, private sector certainly is not ready to invest more. So that now the shoe is that on the government has to be worried about. The shoe is on their feet.
In fact, Mr. Dua, if I can just come in there, because you mentioned the private sector, the general sentiment within the private sector has been down and out for the longest time. I think we've been talking about it for several years, about how to get the investment by the private industries going. And while a lot of talk has happened, we've not seen that kind of a response. Add to that the current situation, it only means, and for our viewers to understand, the companies are not going to be making fresh investments. They are all looking at cutting costs. A part of why we're looking at over 2 crore salaried jobs being lost since the lockdown hit us is because the companies are cutting costs. They've cut the fixed costs first. Now they've looked at human resources. They're obviously not going to be making any fresh investments in such a scenario, which then adds further to this entire problem. Mr. Gopalan, in the first 3 months, we saw the government respond with the view of a lockdown to say, okay, people who don't have money right now to survive, let's give some money to them. Companies who will run out of money, cash in hand, let's give them the facility for additional loans so they can survive and tide through the lockdown. The lockdown's over. Many of those schemes, even the welfare schemes, the time for that is done to give the cash in people's hands. Now what do we do? From here on, how do we still fix the economy?
This is a very big problem facing us, as my co-panelists previously have outlined so articulately. Now, we have 2-3 problems which I see are on the horizon. First is that we must ensure that, as Madan mentions, the uncertainty about growth is removed. For that to happen, the government may have to, should intervene in infrastructure push, which is both public sector infrastructure push. Private sector will take some more time to come in to ensure that there is a lot of activity going around in the country, and that gives confidence to the people that economic activity is coming back. This is one important thing to government to do. Second, there are, various productive sectors of the assets of the economy which have gone into problems. For instance, the MSMEs, many of them are closed. Let us say 30% of your eateries in this country are permanently closed at this point in time. So how to ensure that these kind of productive assets do not, die out prematurely? Some of them need to die out, obviously because of inefficiency, but many of them which otherwise would have survived are dead. So how to ensure these productive assets in the economy are able to function? That is the second one. And third one obviously will be how to ensure that the financial sector stability is maintained, because unless that stability is maintained, you will never be in a position to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Now, on all of this, as a social sector problem, is the employment having gone down significantly, about 21 million job losses in the past 5 to 6 months, as some reports indicate. Now, how do we ensure that these productive assets are able to get the employment back, and we avoid the kind of social problems which we may land up later? So these are some of the major issues which I think are important. And within this, there are other issues. But important thing about the private sector, as I mentioned, they will have to have the confidence to really, to see that demand picks up, has picked up already before they invest. The funding for them through financial institutions, bankers, they must have the confidence to lend. Only when they see that, there is sufficient amount of deleveraging has taken place and industries are in a position to see demand and are able to sell and then make money. Unless they get that kind of a confidence, I don't think the bank credit is going to go up. So it's all a cycle, but the first one to untangle the whole thing will be the government's steps, as have been indicated by my co-panelists. A large number of them are on the list. Maybe we will discuss them a little later. But as of now, the initiative lies with the government.
Yes, the initiative lies with the government. Now, I think almost every, expert, economic expert that I have spoken to in the last several weeks is of the view that the government shouldn't think so much about taking on additional debt or the expanding fiscal deficit, as it's called, and should just go out and spend money right now, restart some economic activity. And week after week, I've heard this from the biggest of the experts. All of you, I think, agree on that point, except the government. The government still seems to be holding back. In fact, Mr. Shogata Ghosh, I was just reading up a little bit more about the kind of spending that the government has done in the first part of this year. And there also, apart from, what was needed to help during the lockdown, they haven't done much of capital expenditure. Do you believe that the government isn't even doing what it otherwise would have done in terms of spending money to restart the economic activity?
No, absolutely. The government has to step in in a significant way, because if it doesn't, then the entire pain of economic adjustment will be passed on to the most vulnerable section of the society. And that, I don't know whether a government, no matter how politically dominant it is, can or should afford. For instance, we are already late. We have wasted a lot of time in doing certain simple measures. For instance, the entire loan restructuring could have happened 2 months before. We went on debating. There have been multiple meetings with banks, and finally we came out with a loan restructuring package. Now, it has come. Now we need a government which has to spell out what it needs to do. It could be a subsidy to small businesses, an interest subsidy to small businesses so that their interest cost, their finance, the cost of loan goes down. It could be a cut in tax on oil. It could be many other things. It could be just not an interest rate cut, which RBI likely to do in October. But we understand that there is not much space for fiscal profligacy or fiscal expansion. But at the same time, this is an overwhelming situation. And the government should make a very clear and bold and conscious bet on growth. It should say, okay, this is an overwhelming situation. This is a catastrophe. The fiscal deficit will go up. But in 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, as and when situation improves, we'll claw back the deficit and we'll maintain some discipline. Now, if that kind of guidance goes out, it will reassure the financial markets, the rating agencies, as well as the businesses. And it will do a world of good to the economy.
Okay, I take your point. In fact, let me bring in Mr. Madan Sabnawis also on that point. Mr. Sabnawis, the fact that the government needs to take the lead on it, and I think and we've talked about it, and I've heard it so many times in the last few months, but it doesn't seem to be happening. Where is the hurdle?
I think it's a very interesting issue, and I think Mr. Gopalan and Mr. Dua has worked with the government, and they'll probably testify that it's not so easy for one to say that let's put another 2 lakh crores on the table and spend, let's make it 2% of GDP, 4 lakh crores. I think as economists, we probably think it's very easy, something which we can decide sitting in a discussion that we should be increasing the fiscal deficit, start borrowing more money. I think there are more serious implications about it. Now, the basic issue, I think, with this particular government is ideology. And I think if you look at the way the BJP or the NDA, rather, has been behaving from the beginning is that the government believes that it's an enabler of growth. It's not the instrument for growth. So it provides the right kind of structure for the private players to play, and it's a private sector which has to take on the initiative of growth. Now, one can actually argue saying that these are very special times, and there is more direct intervention which is required from the government. And we would all like to see it. We would all like to see the government spending in a big way. But we should just think that today the government is already having a problem on account of this slowdown. I think it has been affected the most because its revenue has fallen. And this entire controversy which we are seeing about states and center and GST is all because of this slowdown. So it's a very tough call to take about whether you should be going in for higher monetization, get the RBI to provide the money. I think these options are open. I think the government is also cognizant of it. And I think that we are not the only intelligent people. We probably have more intelligent people sitting in the government who can take this particular decision. So I think it's all about the ideology. Hopefully, at some point of time, there will be the intervention from the government, the way in which we're discussing, so as to make things look different.
Okay, so let me then ask this question to Mr. Gopalan then. Mr. Gopalan, like Madan Sabnawis said, there are obviously a lot of other factors. There is the fear of a ratings downgrade the minute your fiscal deficit goes up. Is there something else that the government may be hesitant with? And if they don't want to go the way of higher borrowing and a bigger fiscal deficit, what else is an option then? What is the solution?
Well, I mean, what constrains the government? Obviously, there are the availability of resources. Borrowing is one, there's a limit up to which one can borrow. Even today with the negative growth rate, your debt to GDP is going to skyrocket thanks to arithmetic. Okay, people say it's going to reach up to 84 to 85%. That's because of the denominator getting negative. Now, what do we do under these circumstances is that we have to ensure that there are certain fiscal multipliers which are very much known to administrators, where the economies, impact on the economy will be far greater. For instance, let us take infrastructure. Let us take rural roads. Let us take, roads build up as a whole. Let us look at all other, irrigation works and those kind of things which are possible to introduce. Why I'm saying these kind of off-beaten infrastructure projects is because government, if you want to have a new scheme institutionalized, it takes time to clear. It takes 4 to 5 months to clear. We don't have that much of a time. So the off-beaten programs in infrastructure which government is used to doing, they should focus on spending money so that, I mean, as I mentioned to you, the activity in these things will create the kind of confidence for people to spend. Today, even if you give money, how much of that money will be spent by the people is a question mark. So now, looking at this, there is bound to be, obviously, the total consolidated fiscal deficit is going to be around about 12%. That is something which is understood. But at the same time, is that sufficient enough resources for government to kickstart on this kind of expenditure? Now, there, once again, there is different, I mean, there is another question of a monetization of deficit, which is to what extent it can be done, because it has got to be clawed back at some point in time. The path for doing it is something which needs to be known. But at the same time, government is doing a lot of work for ensuring that industry is declogged from various regulations. Now, how are we going to achieve that at a speedier, at a much faster rate than what we think we are capable of doing? That is where government's, I mean, ability and innovativeness in its functioning will be put to test. And I think the government is seized of this particular matter. Now, I get the impression that there is some, I mean, work going on how to do the next fiscal stimulus, which is required. May not be thanks to the constraints of budgetary, revenue constraints, and also the deficits and the debt going up. There cannot be much of a big one, but the government is, I am told, is considering keenly in another fiscal package. Let us see in what format it comes, in what manner it is coming, and what kind of a fiscal multiplier it is going to, take on, and going to develop or produce. Let us look into all those things. But government, as I mentioned to you, the initiative lies with the government now.
Okay. That's part of the larger, economical economy dilemma that the government has, and they need to figure it out. What kind of relief do they come with? What schemes? They keep saying larger reforms. Of course, if the larger reforms are always welcome, but they don't bring in short-term relief. It's always something that will help us perhaps in the long run. Short-term, what happens? Short-term, and I was reading about this, is a very nicely explained article by Vivek Kaul, who's written, to explain to people, and I wanted to read this out to people. He says, imagine this, in our cities, in our towns, people are working from home. A large percentage of people are working from home, and now I'm talking about the salaried class. They're not traveling anymore. So those offices are empty. Many companies have begun to actually just forego those offices because they're cutting down on their costs. People are not traveling, so they're not taking cabs. Many of the cab drivers will then obviously be hit. Their business, their income gets hit. People themselves are cutting on costs because salaries are being cut, and there is a fear of job loss. So they aren't spending enough, and they won't be for a while until they feel comfortable enough. They haven't been spending enough in the last 1.5 years any which ways. So that impacts the small businesses, the shops around us. Your local kirana store will not end up earning enough. It will impact your local shops, your local marketplaces. It will, if the offices don't function to full strength, people who set up these food stalls, he says, the pakoda walas, which had become a symbol of entrepreneurship in our country, they will not have any business to run because people are sitting at home and people are eating food at home. The smaller restaurants and hotels are already struggling. They are beginning to shut down. Many people have gone back home in rural areas, probably trying to earn some money via Manrega. Those businesses are shut. Bigger industries and bigger sectors like hospitality, tourism, aviation, massive job losses in those sectors, and they're going to take a really long time to recover because with the pandemic around, tourism and travel is not going to bounce back anytime soon. It's beautifully explained, and I think this helps us draw a picture of what will happen around us, where all of us come from, what we see in our daily lives, and that's how that part gets impacted. How do we fix this problem? Mr. Ramakumar, how do we fix the problem of jobs and the ever-intensifying jobs crisis in our country?
Tanvi, I think we need to really focus on employment generation as the immediate challenge in our economy. And I think this is important in both rural and urban areas. The first thing I would say is that we need a major expansion of the NREGS in the rural areas, which will expand to at least 150 to 200 days per household. And you need a major infusion of capital into spending into the NREGS scheme. The second, and you need to do that now. Now is the time. The second is we might do well to start thinking about a similar program in urban areas, the Urban Employment Guarantee Program, which will have the usual manual labor components combined with a skilled component built into it. This Urban Employment Guarantee Program has become another important necessity of the time. So both rural and urban employments will have to be taken care of using this as a starting point. But that will not resolve all our problems, primarily because self-employment is in a crisis. Wage employment in many non-agricultural sectors is in a crisis. So we need to also start thinking about sectoral packages. Sectoral packages have become very important, where we do not make the mistake of the Atmanirbhar package, where we filled the 20 lakh crore with bank loans and with very little of government direct support. Globally, if you see, in April, it was about $7 trillion size of economic package by different countries. It has now become around $10 trillion US as a package. And by 2023, people hope that it will be around 30 trillion cumulatively. So we need to step up now. But in stepping up now, we need to learn from what other countries have done. In other countries where formal sectors are more important, they have these schemes like the furlough schemes, where you finance about 80% of the wage bill of companies, provided they keep the workers in their payroll. Now, we cannot do exactly the same thing in India, but we need to think of interventions where we directly support firms to survive and protect employment, rather than telling them to go to the bank and take a loan. Here, we need package. For example, look at, for example, a sector like poultry industry, which we don't usually consider as a part of the agricultural sector. The total loss in the poultry industry is supposed to be 25,000 crore rupees due to this pandemic. And there we need a sectoral package. Look at milk. Milk farmers used to get 35 rupees per liter prior to the pandemic. It has now fallen to 20 rupees per liter after the pandemic. We need a support package very directly targeted at such small milk producers. We need a package for MSMEs. All the surveys that we have seen of MSMEs tell us that at least 35 to 40% of the MSMEs are permanently closing down, and they may never open again. So there's a huge employment loss there. Yeah. And there is another section within the same MSME category, which is vulnerable, which may not close down, which may survive if we protect them directly with some assistance. So you need an MSME package. Non-loan based MSME loans are important, liquidity is important, but direct cash support and assistance is also equally important, which we forgot during the Atmanirbhar package. So if you ask me, I will say rural employment guarantee expansion, introduction of urban employment guarantee scheme, sectoral packages to sectors, subsectors and subsectors like poultry, dairy, milk, MSME in specific areas which are employment intensive, you can locate sectors which are employment intensive, and you can think of sectoral rescue packages in these. If you need to protect employment, you need such a multi-pronged strategy, and such a multi-pronged strategy requires money to be spent. In the Atmanirbhar package, the biggest drawback of Atmanirbhar package was, if you take the 20 lakh crore rupees, only about 5% of it was fresh government spending. It wasn't directly.
Really about spending money. It was about enabling people to borrow money. Yes, Mr. Ramakumar, it wasn't really about spending money with the government. It was enabling people to borrow more money. It comes back to the same thing. Government says, it comes back to the same thing. Government saying we have no money. Government will again tell us now we have no money. We're not even getting any revenues. Business is down and out. Where are we getting our taxes from? Where are we getting our revenues from? And that just worsens the whole problem. My apologies to Dr. Ajay Dua and Shugata Ghosh. I could not come back to you for a follow-up question, but because of the breaking news, we ran out of time and short on time. But thank you so much to all of you for joining us. This is a continuing conversation. I hope to have all of you again on the panel, for further discussion on what needs to be done to revive the economy in our country. And jobs. The massive job loss in organized and unorganized sector, in the salaried class, and everywhere, urban and rural, is the biggest concern right now. Should be the biggest concern right now for all of us. And we need a clearer roadmap from the government. They need the help. We've got the best of the minds here in our country. Let's get in a huddle together and figure out what can be done. But employment generation has to be the top priority for our government. Because when your economy, when your GDP gets wiped out by 24% in a quarter, that means things are in a disastrous position and dangerously bad. They might get slightly better for the rest of the year, but all the economists tell us that for the entire year, the economy will still shrink by 10%, 15%, if not more. The government needs to take this a little bit more seriously and get proactive rather than waiting for things to worsen. Thank you so much for joining us on this conversation.